So I wanted to start off this series by having Rabbi Priesand come and speak to our community. One of the reasons that I'm on my path, and particularly why I chose to go into the Reform movement, is because of Rabbi Priesand and the Reform movement's embrace of women in egalitarian Judaism. I grew up belonging to both Reform and conservative congregations, and when it came time to decide that I wanted to pursue the Rabbinate, I had to just look at Jewish Theological Seminary and Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, the conservative and Reform seminaries. And I quickly found myself much more at home in the Reform movement, in part because of their passion for pursuing justice, but more importantly, because I saw that female and male rabbis were treated equally. There was no separation between them, and it was truly to me what Judaism should be about, men and women side by side as partners. And Rabbi Priesand was the first in North America to pursue this path. She's America's first female rabbi, ordained in June of 1972, which means she's coming up on the cusp of her 50th anniversary. And I know that'll be a huge celebration among all of my colleagues across all of the Jewish world when that comes around next year. From 1981 to 2006, she served as the rabbi of Monmouth Reform Temple in New Jersey. She became the rabbi emerita upon her retirement. She and I also share a connection to Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, where she was an assistant rabbi. She actually followed in the heels of a rabbi many of you know, Rabbi Jim Perman. And many years later, I was the rabbinic intern at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. It's one synagogue that links many of our clergy together. Rabbi Priesand has served on the executive board of both the Central Conference of American Rabbis and the Union for Reform Judaism. She served as a member of the Board of Governors for Hebrew Union College and as a president of the Rabbinic Alumni Association. She's been working tirelessly to promote recording the history of female rabbis and has encouraged her colleagues of all denominations to begin sending their professional and personal materials to the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati to help preserve and document the history of women in the Rabbinate. In 2010, in honor of its 125th anniversary, Good Housekeeping magazine named her one of the 125 women who changed our lives and our world. And beginning in 2017, the Women of Reform Judaism established a scholarship award in her name to be given to a graduating woman on the Cincinnati campus of Hebrew Union College. Originally from Cleveland, she lives now in New Jersey still, in Asbury Park, there near the shore, and she was most recently the contributor to a book, The Sacred Calling, 4 Decades of Women in the Rabbinate. Rabbi Priesand, it is a delight and an honor to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for being here. If I could ask you to unmute.
I always forget to unmute. I'm not too technologically literate, I think. But thank you for that very gracious introduction and for inviting me to share this special occasion with all of you. I do feel a connection to Temple Shalom for more than one reason. As you know, Florida is very appealing to Northerners who are looking for warmer weather. And as it turns out, some of my members have come to Naples and made Temple Shalom their home. And I will tell you that they speak very highly of your congregation and your temple family and all that you've been able to create. And as you mentioned, Rabbi Perman was my predecessor at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. And you, Rabbi Miller, served as a rabbinic intern after I left. And I was present for Rabbi Boxman's ordination. In fact, she read the Torah that day and I had the Aliyah. So that also was a very special moment. So I'm really pleased to be here to kick off your decade of distinction and help you celebrate the 10 years that your rabbi and cantor have been with you as your spiritual leaders. Now, whenever my synagogue celebrated a special anniversary, I used to give a special message based on the Hebrew letter that represented the number of years. And as you know, the number 10 is represented by the Hebrew letter Yud, and Yud is the first letter of three words that came immediately to my mind. God's name, Adonai, Yisrael, Israel, the ones who wrestle with God, and Yerusha, which means inheritance, a reminder that our inheritance from God through Moses is Torah. So the letter Yud represents what I like to call the Jewish Trinity: God, Israel, and Torah. A reminder that we are part of a people whose ancestors stood at Sinai. So my wish for you as you mark this milestone anniversary is that the partnership you have created will continue to grow and bear fruit as together you study Torah and discover what it is that God would have us do and be. May you be blessed with a peaceful sense of life's purpose and everything good in the many years ahead. Shalom uvracha v'chol tuv, may it be so. Now, as Rabbi Miller mentioned, my 50th anniversary is fast approaching. And so what I would like to do today is tell you a little bit about myself and the journey that led me to the rabbinate. I decided I wanted to be a rabbi when I was 16 years old. Unfortunately, I don't remember why. I remember thinking I always wanted to be a teacher, and whatever my favorite subject was is what I was going to teach. So one year I was going to be an English teacher, and the next year a French teacher, and after that a math teacher. And in the end, I decided to be a teacher of Judaism, which is really what a rabbi is. Fortunately for me, my parents gave me one of the greatest gifts that I feel any parent can give to a child, and that is the courage to dare and to dream. And as a result, I remained focused on my goal, and I was not concerned that no woman had ever been ordained rabbi in America, and determined to succeed despite the doubts I heard expressed in the organized Jewish community. In those days, I did not think very much about being a pioneer or the first of something, nor was it my intention to champion women's rights. I just wanted to be a rabbi. Although my parents were actively involved in the Jewish community, Jewish organizational life, my family was not particularly observant. We did light Shabbat candles, have a Hanukkah celebration with our extended family, and have a Passover Seder, to which my siblings and I were always encouraged to invite a non-Jewish friend to come and join us so they could learn more about Jewish tradition. I can still see my father, Alav HaShalom, seated at the table, getting up to wash his hands at the appropriate time, reclining on his pillow, and explaining the symbols on the Seder plate and reading aloud every single word of the Haggadah. My mother, of course, had been preparing for days, making gefilte fish from scratch and fashioning those delicious matzah balls that were especially light and fluffy. Now, one year, my father's business brought him into contact with a Catholic children's home, run by a group of nuns. Passover was approaching, and in the course of conversation, the Mother Superior began asking questions about the customs and traditions of this holiday. And before long, my father had offered to conduct a Seder for 52 nuns and the Monsignor, volunteering my mother, of course, to oversee the meal and make enough chicken soup and matzo balls for all the participants. My father read the Haggadah, and the youngest nun recited the 4 questions. My mother, whom we lost just a few years ago at the age of 101, remembered entering the dining room on that day and seeing, really being greeted by a huge sign that simply said, Shalom. And the nuns presented her with a beautiful tiered silver tray that we continue to cherish. My father died in 1968. I will never forget the kindness of the nuns who, dressed in their traditional garb, came to our home while we were sitting Shiva to remember my father and give thanks for his life. And I'm ever grateful to my parents for teaching us by example that all people are God's children, and we have much to learn from each other. As soon as I began to express more than a passing interest in our religious heritage, my parents made certain to include among my birthday and Hanukkah presents more Jewish books, often inscribed by my father with a few words of encouragement, a wonderful way to expand my horizons and at the same time validate the seriousness of my intention. I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland. And when I was in the 8th grade, my family moved from the east side to the west side. As a result, my teenage years were spent in a predominantly non-Jewish neighborhood. In fact, my brothers and I were the only Jews in our high school. That made our participation in religious school and youth group all the more essential. We were members of Beth Israel, the West Temple, the only congregation on the west side of Cleveland, a small congregation that taught me important lessons about what it means to be a temple family and how central to Jewish life is the task of tikkun olam, repairing the world. Although I did not become bat mitzvah, I was confirmed and continued my religious education through the 12th grade. As the time for college approached, my desire to be a teacher of Judaism remained firm, and I knew that for me, the best way to accomplish that goal was a career in the Rabbinate. I applied to the undergraduate program, jointly sponsored by the University of Cincinnati and Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. I was accepted, and in 1964, I began my studies. My years at rabbinic school were fraught with challenge. Some members of the college community thought that I came to marry a rabbi rather than be one, and my sincerity was often suspect. In fact, at one point, I had been dating a fellow student for some time when a professor went up to him and said, well, when are you going to do the school a favor, marry her and get rid of her? So, you have to remember that I was really the only woman for most of those years in the whole school in Cincinnati. I always felt that I had to prove myself. I felt the need to be better and do better than my classmates. so that my commitment and my academic ability would not be questioned. Occasionally, I sense that some people would not be overly upset if I failed. And more than once, it would have been easy to drop out, but I persevered because I truly wanted to be a teacher of Torah. Happily, I had the support of Dr. Nelson Glick, who was at that time the president of the College Institute. He gave me his unqualified support and took care of a lot of little problems in the background that I probably never even knew about. Unfortunately, he died the year before I was to be ordained. But his wife, Helen, a distinguished physician in Cincinnati, told me that prior to his death, he said there were three things he wanted to live to do, and one of them was to ordain me. It's important to remember that it was his vision and his commitment that laid the foundation for the ordination of women. And fortunately for me and for all of us, Dr. Alfred Gottschalk shared that vision. And when he became president of the College Institute, he made the dream a reality by ordaining me on June 3rd, 1972, together with the 35 men who were my classmates. Only in recent years have I come to understand how bold and daring that action was on his part. Apparently, certain members of the faculty tried to convince him that I should not be ordained, even though I just had 1 year left in my studies. 50 years ago, I did not really understand the amount of pressure he was under, nor did I understand the courage it took for him to step into someone else's shoes and fulfill a mission that someone else had begun. How grateful I am that he was willing to do that and to affirm the equality of women in the Reform Jewish community. Finding a job was not all that easy. Some congregations wanted me for my publicity value to be able to say that they were the first, and others wouldn't talk to me at all. In the end, I was the last person in my class to get a job. But in my opinion, I got the best job of all, assistant rabbi at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City. It always seemed particularly appropriate to me that I would come to a synagogue with a reputation for commitment to equality and social justice. And the senior rabbi, Edward E. Klein, always took great pride in being introduced as the first equal opportunity employer in the American Rabbinate. I stayed at the Free Synagogue for 7 years. And to be honest, the circumstances under which I left were not all that pleasant. I hoped I would be given a chance at some point to be the senior rabbi, but that was not to be. Neither that synagogue nor any other was willing to grant the title of senior rabbi to a woman. Indeed, for 2 years, I was unable to find a full-time position. So I served as a chaplain at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York and accepted a part-time position at Temple Beth El in Elizabeth, New Jersey, a synagogue of older members who were always warm and welcoming. In 1981, I became rabbi of Monmouth Reformed Temple in Tinton Falls, New Jersey, a position I was privileged to hold for 25 years. The decision to retire 14 years ago was my own, believing as I do that rabbis and a lot of other people should know when to leave. You should leave when they still like you. And I retired, but I became Rabbi Emerita. I didn't move away from my community, and I'm still very much a part of it. And I worship at my temple every week, enjoying the view from the pew. I have never regretted my decision to enter the rabbinate, and clearly my life has been enriched by the people I have been privileged to serve for it's been nearly 5 decades now. And I am grateful that part of my life's work has been to open new doors for women in the Jewish community. But at the same time, I have tried never to lose sight of the larger mission of the Jewish people, which is to derive from the words of Torah a set of values and a sense of holiness that will enable us always to be partners with God in completing the world. And what that means from my vantage point is not only participating in the task of Tikkun Olam, but creating a Jewish community based on equality and inclusivity, remembering that all of us are God's children, and as such, we should all have the opportunity to fulfill our God-given potential to the fullest. My experience tells me that we are richer for the gifts that female rabbis and female leaders bring to our shared task. Rethinking previous models of leadership and opening doors to partnership and networking. Discovering new models of divinity, knowing that God possesses characteristics both masculine and feminine. Training new leaders to be more gender aware by welcoming to our institutions of higher learning respected female scholars, able to share with us valuable lessons and insights unique to women. Creating new role models and allowing to be heard, often for the first time, the stories of those whose voices have been silenced for too long. The countless number of women who have enriched our people from biblical times on. Surely one of the most powerful lessons we have learned from the civil rights movement is that if you do not see someone who looks like you in a position of leadership, then you begin to think it is not possible. And we teach our daughters and our sons that everything is possible. There are no limits on what they can achieve when seeking to fulfill their creative potential and contribute to the vitality of Jewish life. But sometimes when they interact with the institutions of Judaism, they discover a different message. A message that continues to exist in the larger society of which we are a part, a reluctance to believe that women are as competent and capable as men. For decades now, we have been trying to change that attitude in every field of endeavor. Medicine, law, accounting, education, even politics, where we finally broke through. And for the sake of our survival, we need to continue to work to change it in the Jewish community, to make certain that our daughters and granddaughters can be whatever they want to be, that they have not only equal opportunity, but equal pay. You may be surprised to learn that in the Jewish community, female rabbis are paid considerably less than male rabbis. And that what's happening in our larger community, it happens in the Jewish community as well. And so, 80% of what a male rabbi is paid is just not appropriate. And we also have to make certain that that our daughters and granddaughters are free from all forms of sexual harassment, of which there have been many stories also, quite unfortunately. Ordaining women as rabbis has also taught us something about the meaning of success. When I was first ordained, I thought the ultimate goal was to become rabbi of a very large congregation. Indeed, as the first woman to be ordained, I thought it was my obligation. And in so many different ways, we are taught that bigger is better. But in reality, life is not measured by wealth or power, by material possessions or fame. Life is counted in terms of goodness and growth. Someone once said that our purpose in living is not to get ahead of other people, but to get ahead of ourselves. Always to play a better game of life. That is what success is all about. Have we done our best? Are we continuing to grow? Are we affected more deeply today by love and beauty and joy than we were yesterday? Are we more sensitive and compassionate to others? Have we learned to overcome our fears and accept our failures? Have we triumphed over selfishness and bitterness, cruelty, and hatred? Do we count our blessings in such a way that we make our blessings count? That is success. And in the words of Albert Schweitzer, the great secret of success is to go through life as a person who never gets used up. Grow into your ideals so that life can never rob you of them. Now, people often think that I am history's first woman rabbi, but that is not true. And so I want to spend a few minutes telling you about Regina Jonas, who was the first woman in the world to become a rabbi. She studied for the rabbinate in Berlin, but the professor who was her mentor died the year before she was to be ordained. And then the seminary refused to follow through, even though she had completed all the requirements, including a thesis entitled, "Can Women Serve as Rabbis?" She was forced to wait until 1935, when she was ordained privately by Rabbi Max Dienemann, president of the Association of Liberal Rabbis in Berlin. At first, she was permitted to work only in hospitals, homes for the elderly, schools, and then later, as rabbis began to immigrate or be deported because of the Holocaust, she was invited to preach and fulfill rabbinic duties at various synagogues, gaining a reputation for her pastoral work and her preaching ability. A few years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Berlin and walking in the footsteps of Regina Jonas, together with a group of rabbis, historians, and lay people. The trip was the idea of Dr. Gary Zola of the American Jewish Archives. He convinced the United States Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad, on which he served, to place a plaque at Terezin in memory of Regina Jonas. And he invited the Jewish Women's Archive and its founding director, Dr. Gail Reamer, to co-sponsor the trip. It was an absolutely amazing experience that words can not really convey. You can learn more about it from your member, Len Teitelbaum, because he and his wife, may she rest in peace, were together with us on this trip. Now, I was quite shaken by the number of similarities between my life and that of Regina Jonas. She did not see herself as a pioneer or a famous person, and neither did I. I just wanted to be a rabbi, and so did she. Both of us shared a similar definition of feminism, that is, that all people should be given the opportunity to fulfill their God-given potential to the fullest. Her mentor died the year before she was ordained, and so did mine. In her case, the seminary refused to follow through, even though she had completed all the requirements. In my case, those who tried to stop my ordination were unsuccessful. I was always held to a higher standard, as was she, and often male rabbis and lay leaders told me to be patient, a word with which she was also familiar. She did not think that a female rabbi should marry and have children. It would be too difficult. And ultimately, I came to the same decision, believing I myself would never be able to do both and do them well. She loved to preach and teach. In Terezin, we found papers on which she had handwritten the titles for some of her lectures: Women in the Bible, Women in Judaism, etc. All are topics that women rabbis have always been asked to speak about. Before being deported to Terezin, Rabbi Jonas gave her documents to the Berlin Jewish community for safekeeping. Had she not done that, we would know even less than we do now about her life and the significant contributions she made to the Jewish community, which continue to bear fruit even today. And not realizing that I was in effect following in her footsteps, I announced several years ago that I would donate all my papers to the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, and I invited all women rabbis to do the same, of whatever denomination, so that those doing research about women in the rabbinate could come to one place and find all the material they needed. When we were in Berlin, we had an opportunity to see her papers, which had remained hidden until after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that really is why we never heard of her, because everything was hidden away. We were overwhelmed with emotion when the archivist brought out this tiny little box of papers, all we have left of Rabbi Regina Jonas, except for those few handwritten notes that we saw in Terezin. It was at Terezin that we dedicated a plaque to her memory, ensuring that she would never again be forgotten. Participating in the ceremony were, among others, Helga Hoskova, an artist who is one of the few remaining survivors of Terezin, and her son and granddaughter, who provided music on the violin and organ for the ceremony. I will never again hear Kol Nidre without remembering their rendition. Helga's story reminds us that God enables ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and that Holocaust survivors triumphed over Hitler's madness by returning to life rather than retreating from it, by having children and grandchildren, and showing that despite the horrors of the Holocaust, there is meaning and purpose in human life. Now, the four firsts, as we call ourselves, Rabbi Sandy Sasso, representing Reconstructionist Judaism, Rabbi Amy Eilberg, representing Conservative Judaism, Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz, representing Modern Orthodoxy, and myself, representing Reform, participated in the ceremony at Terezin. And if I were with you in person, I would be showing you a 10-minute video of that ceremony. The good news is that you can go to the Jewish Women's Archive website, jwa.org, and you can see it for yourselves. Each of us read a passage written by Regina Jonas herself. And this is part of what I chose to read. I hope a time will come for all of us in which there will be no more questions on the subject of woman. For as long as there are questions, something is wrong. But if I must say what drove me as a woman to become a rabbi, two elements come to mind: my belief in the godly calling and my love for people. God has placed abilities and callings in our hearts without regard to gender. Thus, each of us has the duty, whether man or woman, to realize those gifts that God has given. If you look at things this way, one takes woman and man for what they are, human beings. Now, it amazes me that this was written back in the 30s, 40s, and it still bears truth today. There was something quite remarkable about giving life that day to her words and affirming our connection to her. Then we recited El Malei Rachamim, perhaps the first time that this memorial prayer had ever been recited for Regina Jonas. As I think about her, one of the things I most admire is that she chose the well-being of her people over her own self-interest. She could have escaped the horrors of the Holocaust, but chose instead to accompany her people to the concentration camps, to continue to minister to their needs and help them find meaning and purpose in the values of Jewish tradition. We cannot help but stand in awe of her courage. And when we returned from our journey, prepared to tell her story, to ensure that she is given her rightful place in the chain of Jewish tradition that binds together all the generations of our people, past, present, and future, determined to make certain that her yahrzeit would be observed from year to year in synagogues of all denominations. The actual date of her death is unknown, but with the help of the Holocaust Museum in Washington and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, we determined that she was taken from Terezin, together with her mother, on October 12, 1944, and arrived in Auschwitz on October 14th, 1944, where it is assumed that she was murdered that very day, because we never heard anything else about her. And we discovered that that day happened to be Shabbat Bereshit, the day on which we begin our Torah over again. So we have chosen Shabbat Bereshit as the date of her Yartzai. And we hope that next fall you will join us in saying Kaddish for her. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share her story. I like to think that whenever we do, we bring honor to her memory. I conclude now with some words of wisdom that came about several years ago when I was asked to contribute to a book edited by Molly Mayer called "If I Only Had 5 Things to Pass On from My Life, They Would Be." Unfortunately, I think the book was never published. I was very disappointed because I wanted to hear what other people said. But I will tell you that this is an excellent task for slichot, for just before the holy days, when we take stock of our lives. Think about what are the most important things to you. And here are my 5. First, know yourself and be yourself. When I was in rabbinical school, I always assumed I would marry and have children. In fact, I often said that in my synagogue, there would be a nursery next to my study. After I was ordained and began serving God and the Jewish people, I discovered that I would never be able to have a career and a family and do both well. I stand in awe of those who can, but I know that I am not one of them. I chose to devote all my time and energy to my career, and I have never been sorry, because I know that the people whose lives I touch are now part of my extended family. Second, don't worry. There are moments in every life when worry overwhelms us and inhibits our ability to function. For those times, I have developed my worry rule. Sit down every morning for 10 minutes and worry as much as you want. Then get up and welcome the many opportunities for growth and for good that a new day brings, and make the most of them. You'll have 10 minutes the next day to worry again. Third, always try your best. Many people hesitate to try new things because they are afraid of failure. I believe the only true failure is in never daring to fail. Success feels good, but there is nothing wrong with failure as long as we try our best and learn from our mistakes. The world moves forward every day because someone is willing to take the risk. 4, live with humility. Our sages taught people should have 2 pockets so they can turn and reach into one or the other according to their needs. In one pocket, there should be a slip of paper with the words, "For my sake was the world created," and in the other, the words, "I am but dust and ashes." In our day and age, humility seems to be a forgotten virtue. Being humble does not mean that we should deny or negate our achievements. On the contrary, taking pride in what we have been able to accomplish brings great joy. But pausing to remember that we do not stand alone is even more enriching. Saying thank you on a regular basis to God, who gives us the power to create, and to others who have helped us along the way, keeps us from becoming arrogant. And 5th, maintain your sense of humor. One way to deal with life's difficulties is by discovering and embracing the healing power of laughter. Many a tense moment has been relieved by bringing a bit of humor to the situation. An old Yiddish proverb advises, weep before God, laugh before people. Learning to laugh soothes the spirit, and learning to laugh at yourself keeps you from taking yourself too seriously. Laughter is contagious, and it makes the world a much more pleasant place. Let me now conclude my remarks and prepare for your questions by sharing with you my favorite poem, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, which pretty much sums up the way I feel about my life. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Thank you so much. I'm pleased that you invited me to be with you, and I send you all the best for this wonderful year of celebration.
Rabbi Priesand, thank you. This has been a phenomenal experience. Thank you so much for opening up, telling your story, telling that of Rabbi Jonas. You mentioned your concern that she not be forgotten. Clearly, she is being remembered by you and by others, and now you too will be remembered by all of us for the beautiful story that you shared and for letting us into your journey. A lot of questions have come in. I'm going to try to aggregate some of them and get them to you in different forms. One series of questions came in because you mentioned the four firsts. If you could tell us a little bit more about them, and in particular, people want to know what was the timeline for different movements of Judaism opening up themselves to welcoming women rabbis.
Okay. The four firsts came about when our getting together came about when we were invited to Boston several years ago to a Federation event for Hanukkah. And I was the first time the four of us had been together, and I was so impressed with that on the 40th anniversary of my ordination, I invited them to my synagogue, and we spoke. And then the next day, we went to the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and we spoke there. And we kind of started an effort that was, again, 10 years ago of trying to go around the country. And frankly, I was in charge of getting the gigs. And we would go, appear together, be on the same stage. And I always thought it was important for people to see that four women of different theological backgrounds could be civil to each other and respect each other. And also there were a lot of similarities in our stories. So I was ordained in 1972. Rabbi Sandy Sasso of Reconstructionist Judaism was ordained in 1974. Rabbi Amy Eilberg of Conservative Judaism was ordained in 1985. So you see that there was a bit of a gap, and the conservative movement took a different track than the reform movement. In my case, the decision to ordain me was made by the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. The rest of the Jewish community, of the Reformed Jewish community, wasn't involved in it. The union had nothing to say, the CCR had nothing to say. And so congregations weren't really prepared. In the conservative movement, they studied the whole thing for more than a decade. And in doing that, their congregations were prepared. So there were just two different ways of looking at the situation. And then just a few years ago, Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz of Maharat in Riverdale was the first woman to be ordained by the modern Orthodox movement. I'm happy to say they now have ordained about 30 different women. I was privileged to be present for the first ordination ceremony that they had. Rabbi Hurwitz became the dean of, the founder and the dean of a modern Orthodox yeshiva for women. And that's what she is doing. And they have continued. They're not accepted by the Orthodox movement per se, but modern Orthodoxy does. And I'm happy to say that all the women they've ordained from the first class on found jobs. So they are, through America and Canada, they are serving as rabbis for the Jewish people.
Wonderful, thank you. And I imagine, going to the poem you ended with, being on the road not taken presented some additional challenges for you as you were charting new territory in every respect. How did your family, particularly your mother, embrace this path that you had chosen?
Well, again, I'm really very grateful that my parents and my siblings, everybody really supported me. They just didn't put any doubts in my mind as to whether I could do this. They said, if this is what you want to do, then you should do it. Unfortunately, my father died young, and he was my biggest supporter. He did live to know that I was in the rabbinic program. So I've always been grateful for that. And my mother, she spent a lot of years enjoying talking about her daughter, the rabbi. And, that was very special for her. And, again, I'm really very grateful to them, because without their support, I don't think I would have been able to make it.
A few folks have asked, they're curious, looking back now at what you might have been thinking when you were first ordained, what is it that might be surprising to you is still a challenge today? And what have you been excited or relieved to see has changed more rapidly than you might have anticipated?
Well, I think that probably what I'm most surprised about, and which is what is really upsetting to me, is that many of the problems I had, women rabbis are still having. And it just surprises me a lot. There will be a program coming out very soon on video called Clergy Monologues. And if you were at one of the last CCR conventions or the biennial, you may have seen it in person, where women told stories, not their own stories, but stories of other women, of things that they had to experience and that they're still experiencing. Congregations seem to be always very concerned about what the female rabbi is wearing. Now, I remember that when I was ordained, I had long hair down to my waist. I had short skirts. I wore boots sometimes, and people did not always like that. If you want to see something about that, you can Google me, click on video, and you can see a video from 1973 in which Frank Reynolds of ABC News interviewed me. after my first year at the Free Synagogue. Of course, I'm a very private person. One of the very difficult things for me was to put up with, to become very public and put up with all the publicity. I used to have press conferences in airports when I got off the plane. And, I was interviewed so much that the challenge for me became trying to answer a question as if no one had ever asked me that question before. So it was, it was kind of difficult, and it's upsetting to me that knowing that female rabbis are paid less than male rabbis. We're working on that, and there are a lot of things that we're working on. What I'm happy about is that in the last few years, female rabbis have become senior rabbis of large congregations. And it's taken quite a while for us to get there, but we're there now. And that gives me, really a lot of pride and satisfaction. And in some cases, in more cases than just one, it has been the associate rabbi who has become the senior rabbi. I think that's really important. And in that way, male rabbis can always help in terms of encouraging the woman and the congregation to come together.
Absolutely. And I remember being in Cincinnati when they first did the Clergy Monologues and listening to those stories.
Oh, right.
Hearing the differences in the generations as well that were represented, and knowing that the rabbinate that I'm coming into, that I've been in now for 17 years, is different than the rabbinate of someone who'd been in 30 or 40 years, and appreciating those. So we absolutely can and should be partners in helping make sure that there's equality around. Speaking of equality, I look around and I've gotten the question from a few people. I think about when your class, you were the only woman. And in my class, we were about 50%. And there have been classes where it's been majority female students. People are curious to know your take on that. And if you have any thoughts on why that might be the case, that there are so many women now pursuing the rabbinate.
Well, there's really, as you know, no other profession really in which you have the ability to touch other people in meaningful ways, and often in ways that you don't even know about until much later. Maybe you're lucky enough to find out. In New York, I go to ordination every year. So I remember when the first year, and it was within the first 10 years, I think, there were more women being ordained than men. And I couldn't believe that was already happening. I go to Cincinnati every 5th year for ordination because it means something. It's something special to me. It's a way of renewing my own commitment. And so I've noticed there too that the numbers are increasing. I'm not certain that I can be very specific about why. The doors opened, and and that makes a big change. Just last week in 2009. I was given the Elizabeth Blackwell Award by Hobart and William Smith colleges. And I was informed that Elizabeth Blackwell, by the way, was the first woman in America who received a medical degree. Okay. Just last week, I was informed and invited to write a message that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was being given the Elizabeth Blackwell Award posthumously, and her children, James and Jane, were going to accept it. And they invited me to write a message, which I did, and posted on social media. So that's another example. They told her she couldn't be a lawyer. They told me I couldn't be a rabbi, but we both persisted. We did it, as did a lot of other people. And whenever that happens, one opens the door for other opportunities for women, for girls in our country, throughout the world. That's a very important thing. And another thing that I have always tried to do is hold the door open for those who follow me. That's important too. And it's also important to try to see if we are making progress. So I'll tell you one quick story about progress. In our community, we have a Solomon Schechter school. My Cantor's 2 young children went there. And when her youngest son, Simon, was about 6, he asked me if I would come as his friend for the day. So I said, sure, I'll come. And normally when a community rabbi comes to Solomon Schechter, they like you to say something, and I don't usually like to say anything. But that day I did, because it was the exact day of my ordination. So all the kids are sitting on the floor, these little ones. And I said, not too long ago, when I was not too much older than you, I decided I wanted to be a rabbi, but there was a problem. Does anybody know what that problem was? And a little boy raised his hand and said, you were too young. And then another little boy raised his hand and you were too little. And I couldn't believe that, though, that I looked at Simon. I said, Simon, would you please tell? He said, you're a girl. So, but the fact that those children were not thinking about the fact that women couldn't be rabbis. In my synagogue, I used to tell people, please take your children, because we had a female cantor too. Please take your children to other synagogues so they can see that men can be rabbis and cantors too.
Very good. You bring up the men can be rabbis too. I think that's great. And it's wonderful that the kids didn't perceive that as being a barrier, your gender. And I think about, when I think about the rabbinate and the impact of my female colleagues like yourself and others who followed after, I think the whole rabbinate is different because of your presence, that it wasn't just make them just like the male rabbis, but from talking to my colleagues from prior generations, the sense of compassion, the awareness of the rabbi as having a family, as having a life, of having other pieces, I think is due in part to having rabbis of both genders and an awareness of the bigger person who is there. That's how I feel it. How did male colleagues encounter you when you first came into the rabbinate, and how have you seen that change for yourself?
Well, there are, probably there were some who were really excited. There were some who were not that excited. I know on the day of my ordination, very spontaneously, when I was called to the bima, my 35 classmates stood up. And it wasn't really planned. It was just right there. They decided to do it. And I was very touched by that. And they wanted to mark the historical moment that my ordination represented. The CCAR at the very beginning took a little time for people to change their language. And I remember at the first CCR convention, I think people thought I was a spouse because they weren't used to having women around who weren't spouses, they said the following men have been accepted to membership, and my name was in it. And there were just a lot of things. It took time to change gender and to make people more aware of their language. And here in sometimes you do have to wait, and I've always felt I've felt very accepted and very much respected by my colleagues, and certainly the Women's Rabbinic Network has taken me into their fold. They love one of the things I noticed right away is that they loved. We have conventions of the Women's Rabbinic Network. It's kind of cool to have over 100 women rabbis together. And I realized that they come to see their classmates. And I'm the only one who doesn't have a female classmate. So they've all sort of adopted me as part of their class. And that really makes me feel good.
Very good. So as we reach towards the end of our conversation with you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be a part of our community and to start off our Scholar Series, a few people have asked you to look ahead a little bit and to think about what do you see as the next frontiers of equality within the Reform movement or equality within Judaism as a whole. A few have asked about whether traditional Orthodoxy will accept women rabbis. We don't have to go down that path right now if you don't want, but just in general, what do you see as the future?
Well, the future in terms of female rabbis, I think, will continue to grow, and even in the Reform movement, we've already had 3 women, I think, serve as president of the CCAR. Hebrew Union College has also has so many women now on the faculty, but has also had its first woman serve as twice, I think, the chair of the Board of Governors. That's very important. And now there have been 2 women who have served with the Union for Reform Judaism as chair of the movement. So those are all things that, there will come a time when people won't think about gender anymore. It just, that's how I feel about it. To me, it's taken longer than it should. And that's disappointing, but we're continuing to make progress in all of those ways. I'm sure there will be many more women who will serve as senior rabbis of large congregations, or as the only rabbi of a smaller congregation, which may be a person's choice. We should always remember that that people do have choices. And sometimes when you're the rabbi of a smaller congregation, you do have an opportunity to know more people and to be more of a family. And I think that sometimes there are people who like that, and I know I certainly learned to like that a lot. And you're able to do things. For example, one year I announced that I would have dinner in the temple sukkah every single night of Sukkot, that was going to be my new mitzvah of the year. And I invited people to pack picnic baskets and come and eat with me. I did it every year I was there. From the time I started it, it was highly successful, and it was a time to sit, relax, get to know people, they get to know you, to create a very positive Jewish memory for children, which I think is one of our most important goals. Memories that are so positive, they will want to make certain that their children have the memories too. So I think that we will, I think I worry more about I don't worry as much about the survival of Jews as I worry about the survival of Judaism. That is of great concern to me, because I feel that it is really our ritual which sets us apart. Our values are basically the same. All religions have those same basic values, but it's our rituals that set us apart. And we live by the rhythm of the Jewish calendar. And I think that's very important, especially with having Shabbat every week. So I'm a little bit more worried about that. This week I had occasion to remember Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus, the founder of the American Jewish Archives. And near the end of his life, we were in Cincinnati for convention. The service was at Plum Street Temple, and he was the preacher. And one of the things that he talked about was the survival of the Jewish people. And I remember him saying that we shouldn't be concerned about the quality. We shouldn't be as concerned about the quantity of individual Jews as we should be concerned about their quality. And I think that's, that's important. That's very important. And, I don't know what's going to happen. It's interesting to watch things unfold. We live in interesting times.
Indeed we do. And I think those are very prescient words to hold on to from Dr. Marcus. I wish I'd had a chance to study with him of blessed memory. We have Dr. Zolo coming later in our Scholar Series. We'll have to.
Very good. A good choice. He was ordained 10 years after I was ordained, and I was their ordination speaker.
Oh, wonderful. But I really want to thank you for coming and for sharing these stories, for letting us get to know you, and in many ways, not just making this about our celebration of 10 years, but really letting us part of your 50-year celebration coming up, because now we feel like we can carry on your stories and your legacy and appreciate just how far the Jewish community has come. Mm-hmm. That piece to end on of its quality over quantity, I think, touches all of us. That it's not about the size of the congregation, but the impact that you're having, the relationships you're creating. That's why we call ourselves one family at Temple Shalom, appreciating that piece of it. And having you start off this series, to me, is one of the best gifts I could have had. So thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you
for beginning.
Thank you so much. And when I come down to Florida, I'll pop in and say hello after this whole pandemic is over.
We would love to see you. Just a quick message to those who are with us. A reminder that our next scholar in the series is next week. Dr. Amy Jo Levine, Bible professor from Vanderbilt University, will be joining us that Thursday night at 7 p.m. on the topic of agreeing to disagree, why and how Jews and Christians read Scripture differently. And that's the second part of our 5-part series, one a week going from now until our big event. So exciting for you to join us. I'm thrilled to be able to learn with Rabbi Priesand. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic day.